the Comparative Media Studies program at MIT, where we have a pretty eclectic group of faculty. I'm a sociologist, as was mentioned, a qualitative sociologist. We have computer science, we have film historians, media theory folks. So it's a really interesting department. We're housed in the old Media Lab building. If you recall that building from campus, there's a fancy new one, but we are in the old Media Lab building. And we also have a game lab there that I'm associated with and happy to tell you more about, but you can go to gamelab.mit.edu. Lots of regular events. So if you're interested in gaming and want to kind of plug into the MIT gaming stuff, that's a good resource. The books I wrote were mentioned, and the Watch Me Playbook, I'll have a slide at the very end, but that one has a free Creative Commons version that you're welcome to download and read, so you don't have to buy it. They're all on Amazon, but I say snag the free one. So I'll give you the URL for that at the end. The other thing I just wanted to mention about my biography is I co-founded an organization called AnyKey, which is focused on diversity and inclusion in esports and gaming writ large. And we do a lot of advocacy work, supporting grassroots communities, but also working with corporate and commercial partners. We just transitioned to be a fully nonprofit organization at the end of last year. So I used to be the director of research for that organization, and now I'm chairman of the advisory board. But if you're interested about some of the work that's happening around diversity and inclusion in games, which I can certainly talk to you more about, but you could visit our website, anykey.org, for some info about that. And if you see me glancing to the side, it's because I have two monitors and my slides are on one screen and I have some text on another. So that's, I'm just looking off to the side at the slides. So what I wanted to do today, a couple of things. I want to talk a bit about live streaming in terms of what it is, the work involved, where it comes from, and then also situate that in relation to traditional media and its ongoing evolution and adoption. Because I suspect probably a number of you have heard now about live streaming, and it's one of those things that the New York Times now occasionally does a story, or esports pops into view. So hopefully I'll provide some context for you, and then thinking about traditional media as well. My hope is that by the end of the talk, you not only know a little bit about this slice of game culture, but you also see it as a part of a changing media ecosystem more broadly. I think too often gaming is seen as a kind of curious niche thing. It's sort of set aside. Often that happens in general with play or leisure, but really gaming embodies some of our most central critical cultural concerns. And it's become a mainstream leisure activity. It's video games are no longer just about sort of young men in basements playing. They're played widely across many demographics, including men and women, many socioeconomic demographics. So they're actually a pretty mainstream form of leisure at this point. The other thing too is I've been working in gaming for a while now, and I've really come to feel like it's a bit of the canary in the coal mine for culture. Things often happen in gaming years before they pop up into the mainstream. And it's funny because when I think about it, I started my research on live streaming back in 2012. And I thought, oh, it's kind of an interesting thing that's happening. And I suspect now, though, during this moment of our pandemic, many of you are consuming all kinds of entertainment now via streaming. So something that seemed quite game specific and perhaps even fringe even a handful of years ago now has become, I think, a very common modality for our entertainment and leisure and social spaces. So just a few prefatory remarks there. So it's worth keeping in mind that live streaming doesn't really come out of nowhere. People have long enjoyed watching others play, whether that was huddled around an arcade machine or seated alongside one another on a sofa. If any of you spent time back in the arcades, this probably, you can remember yourself huddling around an arcade machine. There's also been some really fantastic moments where technology companies and game designers have tried to tap into that. This is an ad for one of my favorites where they're trying to put the screen up so it's a little bit easier to see. And there's also actually even been prior attempts at doing broadcasting and gaming. There was a 1980s game show called Starrcade, which ran for a couple of years. They snagged Alex Trebek to host the pilot, and then a longtime game show host Jeff Edwards stepped in. And again, it was this very funny attempt to try to get gaming into a broadcast modality and tap into those pleasures. But there's also other interesting threads, I think, that are worth remembering. And again, I ask you to think back, you might have even had some of these experiences a couple of decades ago. We could also think about streaming as having a lineage connected to the 1990s, when people were experimenting with really early black and white webcams. There was a program called See You, See Me that was really popular in the 90s. It was attempts often to do stuff with NASA and education, but some of us were also using it for our own gaming. This is a very old picture of me playing a text-based virtual world on mud in the background. Maybe some of you did that in the 90s with a video overlay, because we were trying to see what could we possibly do with these webcams. And again, when I think about our current pandemic moment, we're sitting here in Zoom together. This is our current moment. The experimentations we were doing 20 years ago were pretty interesting when you think about where we've come. So these early innovations were very present, but there was also this really this interest in entertainment forms. So there were things like GennyCam, which was kind of the thought that you might follow particular people in their daily lives. And in fact, Justin TV, which was another one of these early life casting sites, is actually the platform on which Twitch TV, which I'm going to talk about today, really comes out of. So Justin TV, this is Justin. The idea was you would follow Justin in his life and many others, and there'd be these kind of really early webcams. This is 2011 Twitch launches, and they started realizing that actually there's a lot of people who enjoy gaming. So it's not just this live casting, that somehow gaming could be something that people start spectating. So for those of you who don't know much about Twitch, right now, if you go to Twitch, you can find tons of different games, genres, people playing. If there's a big esports tournament happening, you will have potentially millions of people watching, but hundreds of thousands. Other times you have small streamers who are broadcasting to 1 or 2 people, or none. They're just trying to build a broadcast. And I should note too that game live streaming is not just unique to North America and Europe. In fact, if you were to go to China, it's a massive media industry where you have multiple websites that are hosting live streams, and a low viewership channel still has tens of thousands of people watching in real time. So what we're talking about here is the real time spectating of people playing games. And I'm just going to show you now. Here's where I'm going to do a little bit of a switch out. I'm going to stop and I'm going to share now my browser, because I just want to show you some clips. For those of you who've never watched a live stream before, you can always head over to Twitch after this talk and sort of poke around and see others. But just to give you a little sense of what it's like, that maybe will help anchor some of my comments. So let me do another switch here with sound. The sound may be a little quiet. I'm going to turn it up, but hopefully you'll hear it. And can I just get a thumbs up if you see and hear this?
Way outside on the train tracks?
He's dead. What's that? Who's this?
You're good.
What?
Great.
You just jumped over the fence? What the?
Oh, no, he was
So you're going to see chat start to flow up on the side of the window as well.
Poor guy.
Did he just run through all 3 of us?
Yeah, I thought it was you for a second.
Parkour over the blue fence and make it this far? What?
Yeah. He tried to
What?
He's now dead.
That was incredible.
To the gate.
If he spawned on that side, he could
I
have
think he was at the med. I think he was at the med bag. 'cause
Oh my
he's got some
God.
stuff on him.
That dude. I need a YouTube video of a gazelle outrunning some cheetahs or something like that, and just getting caught at the last second, because that's what that felt like.
Yeah.
He
Got a
tried.
bunch of like random junk if you guys want.
My random junk now.
I think I need to keep up.
Oh my God, I love the confidence.
Okay, I'm going to show you another quick one. So that was a very popular streamer, Annie Munition. You could see the chat flowing by. You saw her face, her game. You also heard somebody she was playing with. In this one, you'll probably notice that the gentleman is also interacting with his audience a little bit more. So let me just, these are recorded files. These all happen live, but I'm just going to show you a little bit of this one too. Another popular streamer. Different kind of game as well.
On the gem clusters, I should say, right? Clusters.
Should I try volleying the gem I got now? Should I just like pop a vol on that and see if I get lucky? How did it get that fire damage? Why is that the color that it is?
All right, I'm going to stop that one. What I wanted you to notice is he's actually, live streamers do a really interesting thing where they're often externalizing internal processes and talking with the audience. So you could hear him talking through what's happening, but also asking his audience, his viewers for input. So those are two folks who do sort of a variety streams. I just want to show you one more little short clip of an esports event, which is a different kind of thing. You might think of a kind of competitive gaming within a sporting frame. So let me just show you just a little tiny bit of this one.
To run directly at your enemies. And I'm going to pause before we actually see this. This was something special that we got out of a previous mid laner in Teacher Ma. But the engage you talked about, the team fighting, Clement, I like you bring up these points because it does feel like E-Star have optimized nicely. But we've got Twyla on the Syndra here, so running into the Orianna. Bit of a range advantage here, and Mr. Chu, I want you to walk me through what TT looked like with the...
All right, I'm going to stop there. Part of why I wanted to show you that one is I think you might begin to get a sense of how esports is often playing with also sporting aesthetics. So cutting and showing the players, there's some sponsorship stuff in there. And again, the chat window, if there was a really high pressure, exciting thing happening, that chat window is often flying by. Okay, I'm going to go back to my slides now. Let me just get out of this one and switch back. I wanted to show you all those though, because if you've never seen anything like that before, it's good to have something in mind as we go forward. Okay, and hopefully you can see my slides again. Yes, good. Okay, great. Okay, so in my book, I spend a fair amount of time talking about the work broadcasters are doing to innovate spectating games. That was my, yeah, and I showed you that one. Okay. Variety streamers, those folks who play a lot of different titles and operate as essentially one-person television studios out of their homes, really don't just take the game as it's given and pipe it straight out to viewers. Most successful ones are really creating entirely new entertainment products. And in this way, live streaming has offered people a tremendous opportunity to, as I put it, transform their private play into public entertainment through these platforms. And part of what I argue in the book is that these broadcasters are really creative content producers, making shows often for fellow fans and building pretty amazing communities. And that it's creative work if you really pay attention to the broadcast. I was trying to call out for you some of the elements in a typical broadcast. But I often think it's useful to think about the layers of a production. So of course, when you have a broadcast, you have the game in that center of the screen, but you can often see all these other elements layered onto it, other forms of graphics, economic systems. There's a chat window happening. So there's forms of sociality and community labor. And then as I'll show you, I'll transition now, I'll show you just what it sort of looks like on the back end for homes. So basically in the homes of variety streamers, you're going to find essentially small television studios. This is a shot one of a really popular streamer posted to Twitter one day, and I thought it was just such a great encapsulation of what it looks like when you're trying to do essentially a televised product out of your home, cat and all. So we're talking green screens, complex AV setups, lighting, different forms of hardware and peripherals, and the infrastructures, the material infrastructures involved to make this possible are often complex. Users do a lot to try to help each other. You can find really interesting wireframes and schematics people have put together where they're often taking commercial AV products and kludging them together to do something that they weren't always intended. I'll just let this little video run for a minute so you can again have a sense of what it looks like when you start trying to convert your private play into public entertainment and scaffolding up this kind of broadcasting labor that folks are doing. This is a really popular streamer who was tearing down his setup and rebuilding it back, and it's like a 7-minute video of him going around and doing this. So while variety streamers have been doing tremendous work creating this new media genre, esports broadcasters, those folks who are doing formalized competitive gaming and tournaments, have been experimenting with network spectatorship even longer. One of the first broadcasters I met was at an event in 2006 called DreamHack, which is a massive LAN party in Sweden. And this gentleman was basically doing live audio broadcasting of tournaments from the event. So think about early radio and sports. Basically taking what tools he had access to. At the time, audio was the easiest way to get out content. And he was commentating, he was explaining what was happening over a match that was taking place.
Dr.
So
Taylor,
we see this.
Sorry to interrupt, are we supposed to be seeing
No.
the video? Or?
No, just were you not seeing the slide anymore?
Well, we see the slide, but we see a bunch of games on. Is that what we're supposed to be seeing?
Oh, I wonder, we might be, let me restart my slideshow because it might be lagging a little. Let me get back to the slideshow. You see this gentleman now?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, okay, all right. You might have missed the picture of the room I was showing you. I can go back to it another time. Okay, so the esports folks were doing this work on broadcasting games for many, many years now. These are screenshots from my field work over the years. So again, basically people trying to take a variety of equipment and share play out to others, often before there were platforms that really supported it. If you've done any work in media, some of these may begin to look very familiar or similar, because one of the things I'll talk about in a moment is the way game broadcasting has started to converge and dovetail with traditional media broadcasting in many, many ways. One of the people I interviewed early on said, I think in some regards, this world is pushing technology or using tools that traditional broadcasting uses in a very set way and jackknifing it to do stuff it was never meant to do. And I think this is so in some ways classic, well, it's both kind of classic hacker sensibility, but also classic gamer sensibility. Here's a system, how can I make it do what I need it to do for my own purposes? So this work bubbling up from everyday users, be it individual players or third parties, I think gets us into really interesting territory where platforms, game developers, and users not only coexist, but are co-creating culture together. And I just want to, again, really emphasize live streaming and esports is not simply about taking a game artifact as given by a designer and broadcasting out or playing it as is. They get worked over for gamers and users' own purposes. And one of the streamers I interviewed put it this way. So when you stream and you add any elements of customization beyond the game itself, when you start creating your own content, when you start adding humor, you start doing different things, I think it takes it to a new level that is outside of the black and white of saying it's owned by the game creator, becomes something of your own, and it's part of the subculture of the internet. And I'll talk more about what I think this is an interesting provocation to things like intellectual property, but I also think it tells us something quite fascinating about emerging creative production in these new media or social media spaces. The other thing I just want to mention too is that there's a really powerful layer of audience engagement in these streams. That broadcasters are both connecting with their community and their audiences, and audience members are connecting with each other. And in fact, a lot of the reason people watch streams is for that interpersonal and affective flow, that sensibility. It's actually one of the reasons why at AnyKey, we find the call to just hide chat in the face of toxic behavior, harassment, a really insufficient model of engagement, because chat actually can be really powerful. It can be terrific place. There's community building aspects of these spaces online. And so just hiding chat is a little bit like cutting off a live stream, cutting one arm off a live stream. There's something really powerful when people start connecting with each other in this way. And really talented streamers, you heard a little glimpse of it in that one clip I showed you, but really accomplished streamers are very good at toggling back and forth between their own gameplay and audience input and participation. And this was a little screenshot from one of my favorite streams. She was playing a Walking Dead game. So a little bit of it's a horror genre, but it had sort of pivot points in the unfolding narrative. And she would turn to her chat and and ask what, which path might she take next, which is an interesting way of also complicating the idea that games are only played by single people. Like, what does it mean when you have multiple people kind of playing the same game together? So I've really found this side also of live streaming to be really important to talk about. It's funny because a number of years ago, a handful of years ago, television folks started saying, oh, social TV is the way to go. And generally what they meant was that you would be tweeting while you were watching your favorite TV show. And I always found that it was such a kind of a hollow sense of sociality that actually it's when you look at sites like Twitch that you see really robust and interesting forms of community and sociality happening. What's interesting too is, historically user-generated content, as it's often called, when people are producing things and putting it up online, it's tend to be tied to fan culture, and it's tend to be assumed that it's not profit-seeking, that people don't want to make any money for it. And for me, one of the things that's most interesting on a site like Twitch is that, in this moment of the gig economy and unsure labor markets, the opportunities live streaming affords people to try to make some money and perhaps even earn a living, even if it's really precarious, is very compelling for a lot of people. I interviewed a number of people who, for them, they were very creative people, and they sort of felt like, well, am I going to go work at a big box store, or am I going to try to express my creativity through this very precarious, long shot, but kind of fulfilling site? And I think that's a really interesting issue around labor and the gig economy and precarity that's worth talking about. And of course, gamers have long sought ways to kind of build up their skills or get themselves into the industry, whether it was people who produce mods or other forms. So this link between kind of doing something you love for a job, for a hobby, and trying to move it into a professional identity is a long thread. And streamers have been really adept at trying to find ways to monetize what they're doing online, whether it was selling merchandise or donation systems, something I'll talk a bit more about in a moment. They've done a lot to build all kinds of third-party tools to kind of ramp up professionalizing that space for themselves. And for me, the thing that's always been interesting is this live streaming has in the last couple of years become very popular, but it was just something that people were doing on the outpost for a very long time. And only now traditional media and traditional game companies are starting to get interested in it. So I think so far, kind of the picture I'm painting probably of this is a little bit like disruption, and isn't it interesting how all this innovative stuff is happening? I kind of, I'm an academic, so I'm always going to want to mess up the easy takeaways, of course, or maybe a certain kind of academic mess up the easy takeaways, because I think, tropes like innovation and disruption and revolution are always a little bit tricky in understanding cultural production. I want to just talk a little bit about some of the ways user productions have both been captured by platforms and resisted by them when it comes to something like Twitch. So one of the most important innovation users made on the platform early on was around community management. And so I think, as we know from larger ongoing current debates about the role of governance and moderation on social media platforms, users are having to navigate really difficult conversations about what does it look like to have a community, to moderate it or not, to govern it, to manage it. And I'm not saying anything surprising when I say, platforms and social media companies have been woefully behind on providing good community management tools. They, both game companies and social media companies tend to say, we want all these people to come in, but we're actually not going to build a lot to manage them once they're here. And I think any of us who are following current debates around Twitter and harassment and the rise of the alt-right can identify this as something that goes well beyond game culture. And so one of the things that users on Twitch did from the very earliest days is they started creating their own homebrew moderation systems to help manage their chats. This is just a little GIF playing of a multi-moderation system at work, where if you're running an event and you have thousands of people watching and typing, you may need a way, you probably need a way, you absolutely need a way to manage if there's harassing or toxic behavior. And so users themselves were really instrumental in building a lot of third-party tools to implement forms of regulation and social organization and chat moderation systems. And perhaps not surprisingly, as the game industry broadly has been doing, Twitch itself as a platform company went on to learn from, build, and integrate various moderation tools into the platform itself over time. So Twitch now has an auto mod system built in that kind of riffs on a lot of the things that users themselves implemented. So these tools, I would say, increasingly recognize the social structures live streamers created and utilized. User mods still exist, but they now sit alongside platform originated ones. And I think this is one of those examples where we kind of go like, hurrah, that's a really interesting moment of a formal developer kind of watching what their user base was doing and kind of getting in sync and taking it up. But there are other areas that users have innovated that we might want to have a little bit more pause about. One is around certain kind of financial structures. So from the earliest days of broadcasting on Twitch, streamers who really aspired to make it their livelihood were trying to find ways to monetize, as I mentioned, and donation systems were some of the most generative and important, especially early on when Twitch did a lot more limiting who was able to get ad revenue or get subscriptions on the platform. And so you have these really interesting donation systems that come up where people can donate, you know, $1, or I have a little video here of somebody donating a huge amount of money to a cause as a way of supporting the broadcaster. And those donations were not going through Twitch at the time. They were completely third-party systems. There's actually a whole slew of third-party companies that have now emerged to support this. But at some point, perhaps not surprisingly, Twitch noticed all that money flowing from the viewers to the broadcasters and completely around them as a platform. Game companies always face this in different ways. So the question for, I think, many companies becomes, you know, how do we tap into economically the generative activity of users and take a cut? Twitch, of course, had things that they were worried about on behalf of users. Sometimes people will donate money through PayPal and then do a chargeback, and the broadcaster has to face dealing with chargeback systems. And Twitch kind of wanted to protect folks, but it would be naive to not imagine that Twitch also was interested in getting in on the money flowing through the system. And so one of the things that Twitch did is they added what they call a bit system. I don't know if you can make it out on this slide here. I've kind of pulled out. Basically, they said, well, we're going to have a kind of on-platform currency called bits that you can buy for real world dollars, and then you donate those and we take a cut. So, you know, they added this form of currency to kind of supplement a donation system. Scholar Will Parton has argued that Twitch's bit system is a really excellent example of what's often called platform capture, where kind of user and third-party interventions get taken up by the formal institution, folded back into the formal tech design. Beyond these absorptions of how some of the things users have done, I also think there's a really interesting way in which an entire industry has reoriented themselves to the work of spectatorship more broadly. And this is something I didn't foresee when I started, you know, I started the live streaming project because I had finished a book about esports and Twitch had kind of come on the scene. And I thought, oh, you know, that's interesting. I wonder what's going to happen with that. But probably, you know, this issue of reorienting around spectatorship is probably most evident in competitive gaming, where live streaming has really brought esports into game developers and media companies' view in ways nothing really had before. I mean, in the past, game developers pretty much let esports be run by grassroots third-party companies. And suddenly in the last few years, it's really popped onto their radar. So you've been having all of these early third-party and grassroots folks putting their hard-earned money and time, often with very little financial payoff, to build spectatorship. Twitch as a platform and technology that makes it easy to broadcast really changed and amplified things in interesting ways. And in large part because what Twitch does is it helps for the creation of audiences. And here's where we sort of begin to see how traditional media forms start kind of folding themselves into this otherwise slightly niche game culture. So, you know, basically one of the things that Twitch allows people to do is create audiences. And it is important to realize audiences aren't natural, they aren't given, they're actually kind of very specific packagings of demographics and people and viewers that become monetized in particular ways. And so one of the things that I've found most interesting when and again, I'm happy to chat more about esports if you want, I won't say a whole lot more, but one of the most interesting things I think is you start seeing this shift. When I did my book on esports, I would say sports was really the predominant frame through which most of the people involved in that space understood their activities. And since Twitch and the rise of live streaming, I would say a lot of what's happening in that space is thought through an media entertainment frame. And of course, a lot of sports these days is a media entertainment property as much as it is a sporting property. So that's perhaps not a little bit surprising. So the story I've told so far is largely one in which emergent user and community innovations are getting enfolded or captured by traditional media entities. But I think there's another interesting dynamic at work here, and that's when traditional industries kind of come to live in these user and community spaces, the kind of flow starts going a different way. And so, you know, we now, of course, also see live streamers who have lawyers vetting contracts for them, traditional talent agencies, CAA, representing live streamers, sponsors infusing their channels, Drake, famous musicians coming to hang out with him on streams. Maybe you saw that AOC, one of our best well-known politicians who's harnessing social media in all kinds of ways these days, has spent time on Twitch live streaming and bringing politics into the Twitch space through that route. And of course, perhaps most notably, Amazon purchased Twitch for almost $1 billion back in 2014. So I would say some of this is still a little bit the nascent side. I think where you see traditional industries really weaving themselves into live streaming is in the space of esports. And I'm just going to show you a few pictures now, because when you go backstage at esports events, you find often traditional union labor, a labor pool that's, you know, directors, technicians, staff that are drawn from television and sports. You increasingly see production happening in trucks that would otherwise be used at sporting events or the Olympics. This is, you know, where you have traditional directors. This was at a big esports event that happened here in Boston a few years ago. The truck that this is a truck that gets pulled up to venues. Half the people working in this are coming from traditional media industries now and using all kinds of networking, the infrastructure that would look familiar to people who are used to traditional media productions. There's also mainstream media groups are now buying up esports organizations. One of the largest is now owned by Modern Times Group, which is a major European media conglomerate. The NBA now has an esports league, FIFA and European soccer teams. So there's this really interesting way, and we're seeing this flow of traditional industries back into. I'm gonna end in a moment so we have time for some conversation. I'll just mention one other thing in this. This is, I was in China a couple years ago, and I think we're also seeing esports become integrated into really interesting global media infrastructures and production and labor processes. So this was a very big esports tournament where often with these international tournaments, the broadcast itself is white labeled and it's going out globally. It's then picked up nationally and wrapped with regional content, you know, people who speak a local language, graphics packages that are then regionalized and localized. The production was in part run by a multinational crew of esports people, but this truck was rented from China television. So I say all this because it's, again, very easy to sort of imagine, there's this kind of quirky little thing happening in gaming off to the side. But what we're really talking about here are the transformations of the media ecosystem as gaming and live streaming come into view. So the remaining thing I just want to say real quickly, and I'm not going to belabor it, but as I was trying to kind of signal before, I'll just put this slide up as a way of pointing to it. There are actually really interesting intellectual property issues at work here, because one of the things that's quite complex is if you start thinking about whether or not forms of gameplay and forms of live streaming are also a form of transformative work in which new meaning is created, new kinds of aesthetics, new values, then we have to wrangle a little bit more with who owns all this stuff. Do players own their own play? If I create a broadcast and I have a tremendous amount of stuff that's really not just the game being piped out, do I feel like I have some ownership stakes in it? And I will tell you, and I discuss this in detail in the book, many live streamers are caught in this really complicated position where they are, I think, rightly identifying their original creative productions, but realize they are caught in an intellectual property framework that has not really reckoned with this co-creative nature of our culture at this moment. So I hope you've seen this. As give you a final. I have found live streaming just an incredible space to look at this intersection of what I call the televisual, game culture, and the internet. It kind of is bringing multiple threads through. I think it highlights some of our really truly most important kind of cultural conversations that we're having. And I encourage you to take a look at it a little bit more. Like I said, if you want to snag a free copy of that book, don't buy it. If you go to Watch Me Play, there's a free PDF of the book. I've given you little breadcrumbs of arguments, but you can follow them through in more detail in the book. So, and with that, I'll stop the slideshow and hopefully we have a little bit of time for conversation.
We do. That was excellent. Thank you so much. Kudos. Thank you so much. It was awesome. Everybody can unmute, and if you have questions, please ask away.
I'll go first.
Go ahead, listener.
Okay. Toward the end of your talk, Professor Taylor, you brought up a slide which showed World Championships taking place in China. So my question revolves around these interactive games being played in countries with authoritarian governments like China and Russia. Do you think that these games might either be censored by the government, or if they're not censored or regulated by the government, might they lead to eventual reaction, lead to a generation which might demand more freedom and less control of their lives?
Yeah, it's a great question. So games are regulated globally in really complex ways. And China is a really interesting case because on the one hand, many titles have a kind of global audience. The one I showed you the picture of was Dota 2, which is a very popular global title. And so you will find gamers in all countries who are kind of taking up certain games. Countries regulate them in different ways. China has a pretty robust regulation mechanism. So on the one hand, and that's everything from, game developers will sometimes tweak the content so that it fits Chinese graphics visual standards. There's been really notable stuff around this, for example, with World of Warcraft and skeletons, which often get rendered out for the Chinese version. And there are distribution platforms that it's quite interesting. So one of the major ways people get games these days is a distribution platform called Steam. It's a digital marketplace. And only until recently, there was not the native China Steam. They've just now launched that within the last, I think, year or so. And when I was there, I was asking the various people I was talking to, would they be transitioning over to the China Steam platform, which would have much more regulated game access on it. And quite a few people said, no, that would be missing the point. They were going to keep VPNing and pulling their games from the North American, European Steam. So I guess what I want to say is there's a lot of regulation going on, but people are also very good at circumventing that regulation when they want. And if a game has a kind of title that has a lot of interest and energy, it's not unusual to see it played worldwide. I'm giving you a very quick, in terms of, will it spurn on something else? I mean, that's a bigger ticket question. I don't know that I can answer quickly, but I will tell you that young people's, especially their political sensibilities, are often expressed in game communities for good and ill. So we have certainly seen harassing, toxic alt-right game communities, but when the Hong Kong protests were happening, there was really interesting stuff happening in gaming where you had people publicly speaking out. You had game companies having to themselves reckon with, okay, we're Blizzard, we're a major game company. Are we going to allow one of our commentators to essentially say Hong Kong should be free, knowing that broadcast is also going to be broadcast in China or be accessible? So I guess the simplest thing I'm going to say is, as with all things game culture, politics are always present, and people are formulating and expressing and forming their sensibilities in game culture and in gaming as much as other places. I hope that was a somewhat satisfying answer.
There is a question in the chat, Dr. Taylor, and that is, what is the general personality type of those who are drawn to watch Twitch, and how are these types similar to those who watch spectator sports?
It's a really important question, and I thank you for it because it allows me to say something really important for people to understand, which is there is no single personality type, in part because there is no single kind of stream. It would be a little bit like saying, what's the general personality type of those who are drawn to watch movies? Because actually on Twitch or television, on Twitch, there are lots of different types of streams, and there are lots of reasons people like to watch. And it can be anything from, I want to get better at a game, and so I find a streamer who's really good at this game and I try to learn from them, to I'm a fan of a stream and it's really satisfying to be watching somebody play. I'm a fan of a game or a stream, and it's really fun to be in there and talking to other people and watching someone go through it. Or what I think of as one of the most interesting categories I've stumbled upon, what I call ambient sociality. I think increasingly people like to have live streams on in the background while they're doing other stuff. Now, I'm 53. In my house, the television was always on. So the idea that you would have this kind of ambient televisual presence on in your home is not so unusual to me. I think it's fascinating. We're starting to see, I have certainly heard more and more people identify that. So I think it's just important to know there's no single personality type, and there's no single reason people watch. And in fact, people may watch different streamers for different things. Again, in the same way we all probably have, when we're feeling like we want to be cozy and familiar, we watch our favorite movie, versus we're watching with our partner and it's the Great British Baking Show and it's a different kind of moment. We consume media for different reasons in different ways, very similar to for people who watch streams.
I find, if you don't mind a question, there's two kinds of gaming that I like. One is I was playing ping pong with a friend tonight in VR and Oculus. It was so much fun. He was right there. We're like, this is the closest thing to being together, right? And then the other one where I can be with strangers is when I'm pedaling a bike in a virtual reality biking or battle tank type situation. And because it's exercise, it's different than if I'm just playing a shooting game with some rando. I think I'm unusual. Like, the people that you're talking about are into like massive online multiplayer stuff. And I'm like wondering, is that the sociology? Like, is the big market these like people who just get juiced on being part of like a huge gaming community?
Yeah, so it's a really great point. And actually, there are just as many people who are very happy to both stream a quiet single player game to themselves and maybe a couple of friends, and watch a quiet single player game. I mean, there really are, if you were to go, I encourage you, if you're interested in this topic, truly go on Twitch when we're done and just poke around. All caveats, you will find some horrible stuff and you're going to see some terrible chat, but you will probably also find some really interesting stuff. And, you know, I don't think it's all just about the mass experience. Of course, you know, especially in esports events where you're there and you know 100,000 other people are watching and the chat is flying by, you have that collective effervescence that you do at a sports game. But very often, in fact, the majority of Twitch is made up of people streaming to 0, 1, or 2 people. And they're sharing their play. Maybe their friends are coming by and it's a way to spectate with their friends. So it's a pretty diverse range. And you're not so alone. You actually, everything you described about your own habits sounds, it doesn't strike me as anomalous.
All right, we have another question in the chat. It says, do you have any insight into the types of people who are drawn to the role-playing games and multi-user games?
Yeah, so my first book was on a very early MMO called Everquest. I don't know if anybody played it. And I've long felt one of the most interesting things about MMOs is they offer tremendous heterogeneity in terms of play and what you want to do on any given day. And this is becoming increasingly so. I mean, there has in general been a turn towards making games a little bit more friendly to people who may not have as much time. You know, even World of Warcraft right now, still one of the most popular MMOs. It's a little bit, you can consume it in a little bit more bite-sized chunks. But you know, MMOs, these multiplayer games are usually pretty interesting because, you know, maybe what you want to do, or maybe your kind of disposition is to solo quest, or maybe it's to experience the world, or maybe it's to work together to fight a huge monster. All of those different things can be tapped into. And I think part of what at least made them so popular for a while is they really just allowed a lot of different ways to play. So again, you know, I'm not a psychologist, so you'd probably get a different kind of answer if I was. I tend to, my eye and my analytics don't tend to you know, kind of the types of people. More that I think the heterogeneity of play experience is often what keeps people going back to these kinds of things.
Can you comment? Hi, Suli. Nice to meet you, Dr. Taylor. Thank you so much for being here. Can you comment on the role of streaming as an almost a support community? What I've heard from some streamers is, you know, I broadcast when I'm going to be on. I try to be on a couple times a week. If I haven't seen someone in a while, I'll check in with them. There seems to be a real kind of check-in culture as well. Can you comment on that role and where you see that going?
Yeah, it's a really great question. So I think there's a couple ways in which that support mechanism happens. I think the form you're talking about is something you often see with variety streamers, for whom a big part of their value, what they're really trying to bring, is building a community. And so whether it's them getting support by having this kind of regular check-in with their audience or their community, also, you know, community members supporting each other. So I think one of the things you find often, especially right now, amongst, I would say, like LGBTQ streamers, Black streamers, that streaming communities become ways in which communities of gamers writ large are supporting each other, being present, being visible, turning what is sometimes an otherwise toxic place into a really healthy community-based place. So the support angle is a really interesting one. I think you can even extend it, frankly. I've interviewed esports players, you know, competitive players for whom building a community in the same way, it's not quite what they're doing, but for them, streaming is supportive of them continuing to improve their play. So sometimes they talk about it as being accountable. Like if you're a professional esports player and you gotta be on stream a certain amount of time, you're upping your game, you're having to perform in front of people. So support is it's a very rich category. And I think it expresses itself both for the streamers, but for also the viewers as well.
Thank you.
Hey, thank you for such a great talk. Sorry, my dog's here. I was curious about the adaptation or the like almost agglomeration of third-party software that people were making and how they've reacted to their software and their techniques being adapted by platforms.
It's such a great question. I don't know that there's a uniform answer. I think for folks who have really cared a lot about wanting the platform to be healthy, non-harassing, safe environment, the uptake of moderation tools is often seen as a great thing. And, but there are, for example, though, when the bits system rolled out, people had a much more, I would say there was a lot more pause around that. And, I think also when you have third-party companies who've been building tools and then the formal platform comes in and could potentially completely erode their business, you get more tension. So I don't know that there's a uniform answer, but it's a long-standing, I don't want to say point of tension, it's a long-standing tension point in game culture, as I think Alyssa. Like it's, gamers are incredibly adept at social and technical innovations. And sometimes when those get picked up, it's embraced, and other times it's met with a little hesitation. Because frankly, sometimes when game companies pick it up, they pick things up to actually squash them. So they don't want certain functionalities to happen. And that's where I think you see some of the tensions in there. I just noticed too, by the way, I see Mark Paradis noted the Bartle Taxonomy. The Bartle Taxonomy is a classic one. I would also point folks, if you're interested in that question, to Nick Yee at the Quantic Foundry has done, I think, a really nicely nuanced take on trying to disrupt some of the taxonomies. So yeah, Nick Yee is another great person to look for if you're interested in those kinds of questions.
Okay, any more questions? We're at the top of the hour. If not, thank you so much, Dr. Taylor. And
thanks so much.
Yes, thank you for coming. Thanks, everyone.
Have a good evening, all.
Have a good evening. Yep. Take care. Bye-bye.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.